Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining Introduction to SRE from Datadog. My name is Jeremy. I'm the Director of Community and Open Source here at Datadog. Today, joining me, we have Daniel, Waldo, and Leo. I'll let them introduce themselves once we get started. Once again, in this session, we are going to cover and really start with the basics of SRE and then jump right into some practical examples that you can learn from and apply at your organization. We know this is a large, complex topic, and you're probably going to have quite a few questions. We ask that you use the QA section of the webinar in Zoom there, and we'll answer those all at the end as we have time. If there's anything else, feel free to throw it in the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye on that as well. And without further ado, Daniel, Waldo, and Leo.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to today's session on demystifying DevOps and SRE. As Jeremy mentioned, we're going to be covering a lot of material today. The topic is broad, it's deep. Any one of the bullet points we're sharing could be a 7-hour session on its own. So you're going to have lots of questions. It's good to have lots of questions. And as Jeremy said, we're going to be doing a QA at the end. So before we begin, some quick introductions. Again, my name's Dan. I'm on the community team here at Datadog. I'm a recovering system administrator, former SRE myself, and I'm joined by Waldo and Leo. Waldo, why don't you say hi?
Hi, I'm Waldo, and I'm a tech evangelist. I also come from the systems and ops world and have been involved in the DevOps community for quite some time. Leo, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Leo. So I'm currently the engineering manager of our reliability and resilience teams at Datadog. And not a recovering sysadmin or systems engineer, but I'm actually one every day. So I see I have to do that.
To be clear, Leo is our superhero for the day today. And we'll be going to that to talk about practical elements about implementing SRE and sort of the DevOps story here at Datadog. So transition to the next slide there. What is Datadog? Hopefully you've at least heard of Datadog. Standard issue about us slide, right? We're an observability platform, provides full visibility across your organization. You span end to end from your infrastructure to your network, applications, services, micro, monolith, all the way to your end users. This enables everyone, right? You got your ops, developers, anyone in the business really, to have a shared understanding of what's going on, the ability to immediately resolve problems when they arise, really dig into those causes, okay? So for more information on how Datadog can help your organization, just sign up for a 14-day trial, visit datadoghq.com. We'd be happy to get that going. All right. That's out of the way. Let's dive into the good stuff. What are we going to be talking about today? So here are some of the topics in roughly the right order. We're going to start by clearing up some confusion about the terminology, right? If we want to have a conversation about DevOps and SRE, we need a common point to begin from in terms of the terminology. What do these words mean? What are we talking about when we use these words? We're going to start right there. Then we're going to talk about how we can, or one can, structure teams around DevOps principles through SRE ideals, how we've done it at Datadog and how we've seen it done elsewhere as well. The kinds of people that make up effective SRE teams is a big part of that discussion, so we're going to talk about that as well. How do you identify those people? Where do they come from? Hiring them, nurturing internal talent, stuff like that. And then finally, as Jeremy mentioned right off the top of the show, suggestions and practical tips for incorporating an SRE program in your organization. So this is basically tips from the trenches, stuff that has been hard learned in some cases, not only by practitioners at Datadog, but elsewhere as well. So let's dive right in. We'll talk about that first one. When we talk about DevOps and SRE, what are we talking about? Waldo, would you like to do the honors?
I would, in fact, be honored. So a key part of effective communication is having a common language. And unfortunately, when it comes to DevOps and SRE, we, as a whole, the internet's played pretty fast and loose with definitions. So starting off with DevOps, it's a professional and cultural movement that focuses on openness, sharing, and mutual respect. It seeks to improve the quality of life for its adherents, for your company, and for your customers. Availability is the one feature that any application needs. Without the feature of availability, nothing else really matters. And any application's availability is driven by its reliability.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So when we talk about DevOps, really we're talking about the more, I'm going to come right out and say it, the more purist definition, right? We're talking about it as a cultural movement, as a set of ideas, right? And that's how we're going to be talking about DevOps going forward in this presentation. And we're going to, again, dive into this a little bit later, but there's a strong correlation, but not a full overlap between DevOps and SRE. They're actually two different things that we're going to discover a little bit later on. But speaking a little bit more about DevOps, we go, great, it's an idea, it's a culture, it's sort of up in the air. What is it? It's a philosophy. Let's actually drive in and get to some concrete definitions. And one of the big concrete definitions that comes up time and time again, because we're technical people and we love acronyms, is this acronym, these four letters, CAMS, or CAMS, stands for Culture, Automation, Measurement, and Sharing. We put as DevOps practitioners, we put the letters in this order because the other ways you put them are like MAX or SCAM, and that doesn't sound as good from a branding perspective, so CAMS, that's the one. There's a couple different variants. Sometimes you'll see an L kind of wedged in there for calms, which means lean, it's fine. I'll rotate around the same idea. So culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. This is what we're talking about when we talk about DevOps. It's a sort of idea of what these things embody. Leo, of the four here, do you have a favorite?
Well, I work at Datadog, so obviously measurement is one that comes to mind. Yeah, I mean, all of these are important. And maybe what I want to stress in what Waldo and Dan said earlier is that this DevOps thing that we're all talking about and that you can read in many books, many presentations, is actually very fluid. It depends on a lot of factors, and there's no wrong approach to it. I think it's about understanding what it means, and that that can take different form depending on your business, depending on the existing staff you have, the problems you have in your company. And so I think, take it with a grain of salt with what we define here, because obviously without, specializing it to your organization, it is meaningless. What you need to think about is adjusting those concepts to what matters to your organization.
That's 100% correct. And in fact, that's one of the things we go into a little bit later is, throw definitions out the window and figure out what works for you, right? That's super important. So we talk about DevOps, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the culture of it. We're talking about this practice of automation, eliminating toil, as we'll discover a little later on. We talk about measurement, metrics, what to measure, how to measure, why do we measure? And then finally sharing, right? That information sharing, inculcating a culture of sharing. These are super, super important when we talk about what does DevOps mean. It basically means these things. I touched on earlier the idea that DevOps and SRE share a relationship, but they're not the same thing. So let's talk about SRE. And you can't talk about SRE really at all without talking about the SRE book, right? It's the big blue book with the lizard on it. And site reliability engineering has made extremely popular by a large unnamed search company. This came out in 2016 and has become the go-to reference for SRE kind of across the industry. It's impossible to describe SRE without talking about DevOps. And you could say that DevOps is an idea, but SRE is more like an implementation. And this book talks about Google's implementation of SRE, and it's chock full of good stuff. But, and I want to stress this right off the hop, it's not meant to be used necessarily literally, right? Google's problems are not necessarily your problems, but it is a good spot to start with when we're talking about SRE. Leo, quick question. Has this book had an impact on our SRE journey?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it is one of the first books that I think really tries to, write down the different concepts that Google came up with and that defines their style of SRE. As you said, it's very much dependent again on their problems and their way to approach the problems. The audience might probably know that there's actually a second book following this one, which is about, I quote, practical ways to implement SREs. I think that's what I want to stress with this book is seeing it maybe as a toolkit, you know, as a resource with a lot of tools and concepts that you can think about when you try to implement SRE in your organization. And of course, we did when we created back then an SRE team at Datadog. And maybe I'll come back to that in the history of what SRE is at Datadog and how it became SRE. But it definitely helped us shape some of the concepts that we use every day now.
Excellent. Waldo and I actually had a discussion on this not too long ago, and we talked about the fact that this book, the SRE book, has actually had a really big influence on much of the industry. Rather interestingly, it's not necessarily exactly what Google does internally. Remember, this book was originally published in 2016, which meant that it was written prior to 2016. And in the intervening 4 years, things have changed. So the important thing is to look at this and go, this is a great starting point for having those discussions, for generating those ideas. But a lot of the SRE journey, the DevOps journey in your organization is going to be about how you choose to implement things. And we're going to go through some tips and tricks and some pitfalls, of course, a little later. But it's all got to start somewhere, right? We've talked about this terminology. We've talked about this idea of philosophies and this book, which is really good, but it's not a Bible. That's fine. But let's get into some more concrete stuff, right? Where can you begin on this journey? And as with everything, it begins with people, right? And what are people inside an organization? Their teams, their groups, their squads, their ways of organizing, self-organizing or auto-organizing, whatever that means. How can we do that effectively with DevOps principles and with SRE in mind, right? So let's discuss sort of that team and organizational structure. Waldo, why don't you kick us off and talk a little bit about sort of these key ideas when we talk about organizing one's organization.
So one way that's very common in effective effective DevOps cultures and SRE in particular is to organize your engineering efforts around product teams. And what this is, they're typically a cross-functional organization team that can solve most of its own problems, and they're tasked with providing solutions to a business problem. When they bring that solution to bear, they also operate it. When you pursue the product team route like Datadog has, you may feel that you're missing out on information. It may become more you'll change the way that you share information, especially with people that share a similar skill set to you. Whereas when you were sitting around people of similar skill set but solving different problems, the information flowed in a different way. Now, to that end, Datadog has a concept of squads and guilds. Now, these are sub-communities that cross our product team boundaries.
That's exactly correct. So we do have squads, we do have guilds, we do have product teams, and you know, they fulfill different needs. They exist for different periods of time. Leo, if you could actually just talk a little bit about at Datadog, kind of what does the word squad mean for us?
So squad is when it is something that is short-lived at Datadog. So. And short-lived is maybe like a bit of an abstract definition. So usually it means 1 quarter or a couple of quarters, but no more. And the idea is, you know, when you have a problem that is basically overlapping several teams' responsibilities, or that just requires a collaboration of multiple teams to get to a result, then you assemble that squad, and it's basically like an ephemeral team that will have like dedicated objectives for like a couple of quarters to get to that result.
You touched on something I think really important right there, which is having objectives, right? A squad, because it's temporary, needs to have a clear vision for success, right? What does the end mean? right? What would be a way of defining that? Is it something we could do, with, for example, with an OKR?
Yes, OKRs are a framework. We talked about concepts and implementations earlier with SRE and DevOps. I mean, OKRs are exactly the same thing. It's an instrumentation. It's an implementation of a tool that gives you objectives for a group of people. And so that's what we do, for instance, at Datadog. And they have pros and cons, and it's always a trade-off, choosing a solution. But quarterly objectives are interesting in the way that basically it's not too frequent. So it is doable even at our scale to have people review OKRs from other teams. If we would do it more frequently, maybe that would be not an option. But at the quarter frequency, we are able to publish OKRs at the company level and get buy-in from other teams, but also get buy-in from our executives.
That sounds great. And again, the important thing there is that the squad it's short term for values of short, right? That it has a goal that it needs to accomplish, and that once that goal has either been accomplished or there's a decision made, a mutual decision made to disband that squad, that it has to have an end point, right? It doesn't just exist forever. And that's a key element of the idea of a squad. You might see other terminology for this, right? Tagger teams and so on and so forth, but that's super important for us. Another important way of organizing things is around this idea of guilds, right? So the imagery here is of a 16th century, Dutch guild. But it's a little bit humorous, but the concept still remains, right? Guilds are a bit larger than a squad. They're a bit more long-lived than a squad, but they still have that idea of being cross-functional, of touching on a number of sort of different areas. And the idea here is, again, to have a goal, to have a definition of done, to have executive buy-in, but on things that might take a little bit longer to unfold, especially around exploratory work, such as, how are we going to do different types of front-end work going forward, or we need to start going on call. How can we do that in sane ways? And bringing people together to start thinking about that and running experiments. And the big difference between a squad and a guild, again, the squad is a little bit smaller, more short-lived, and really tightly coupled with a single objective. The guild, a bit more long-lived, a little bit bigger, and perhaps a bit more nebulous with its end goals.
So I tend to think of guilds in terms of, this is where a set of functional knowledge resides, and this translates to in the modern day, it's often in terms of unions, where you begin as an apprentice and you develop your skills within a field and become a journeyman and a master and so on. So I think of guilds as a way to preserve that knowledge that you would have had if you're organized by function rather than by team. But another important thing is to, unlike in your professional life, you being a woodworker or a metal worker, you can be a member of multiple guilds in this manner. So examples of those that we have guilds for like front-end engineering, but we also have guilds for being on call, and just a way of sharing knowledge and practices amongst people within your guild.
For sure. We have a guild around documentation as well, which was a relatively new one. I think it's an interesting initiative. Go ahead, Leo.
I was just going to react with, Waldo just spoke about knowledge, and I think that's really important around defining a guild. Another word that I like to use for a guild is creating a community, basically of members that care about the same topic. And so on-call and front-end, as you said, is a good example of that. Like you want, even if you have different products in your organization, you want all your front-end engineers being able to communicate the good best practices that you have, the tools that work and those that do not, things like that. And we gave examples for DL, so maybe let me give an example for squads as well. So for instance, we have a web API, and we wanted to refactor that API. And so we created an API v2 squad. And by design, because once we release that v2, the work is done, then that's the definition of a squad.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, no, that's good, and it's good to see, kind of go from the idea to the lofty to, okay, actually, how was it accomplished, right? So that's excellent. I see you have a question in on the chat. Thank you for that question. We will absolutely get to that towards the end. It's a good question. All right, moving right along. We talked about squads, talked about guilds, talked about organizing things. So let's, really hammer that home, right? We talk about DevOps, the idea, SRE is the practice, right? It's the implementation. And we talk about a cohort of site reliability engineers, right? If we put them together, they're a group, that's a team. The thing about that to remember is that SRE teams are super versatile, right? And they're supposed to be versatile. They can be involved in a number of different areas, from code review, incident response. They could be supporting a dedicated portfolio of products. They could be working to support a product team, or even embedded within that product team. And speaking of embedding, any one individual SRE, so any one individual human practicing the SRE discipline, could form part of a dedicated team, could be embedded within a product group, could participate in sprints. There's a lot of different ways that this can be organized. And the reason I'm pointing this out so explicitly, right, is that you'll see literature out there, and you'll see consultants out there who will tell you, no, this is the one true path. And the reality is you have to figure out what works for your organization, right? The one true path is the path that works for you, right? So again, SRE as a discipline, and the idea of SREs organized into groups and teams, the keyword here is versatility, right? Leo, would you say that we lean on our SRE team's versatility at Datadog?
Yes, definitely. It's a role that is sometimes hard to define, coming from a pure software engineering world. But yeah, again, like the book, for instance, lays out some concepts to understand better that I would say a mix between a software engineer and a systems engineer, which are most more common terminologies that I think are used out there. Something else I wanted to mention about SRE organizations, and I think coming back to why are we doing SRE? Because we need to make sure availability is something that's important for our organization. And so if you care about availability, somewhere in between there's on-call and production. And so the way you structure teams usually from the start is based on your on-call responsibilities and how you organize your production environments. And that versatility is sometimes something tricky to get right, because I think we'll get to that just after, but it could be you have one production team, and then does that mean like all SREs get into that production team? Or maybe all your developers are on call, and so does that mean that you have to put SREs everywhere with developers? So really, I think there's a lot of questions there, but again, like I think there is no general statement that's easy to make. So it's all about understanding the concepts again.
Yeah, and that's critical, right? Is to have those ideas, to have that base, to have that common language where you can start to have those conversations, within your organization, identify those stakeholders, so on and so forth, right? And it all starts, as Leo mentioned, with these precepts, this common language, these ideas. What does DevOps mean? What does SRE mean? And it's okay to be fluid about it, right? So where does that bring us to, right? We've talked a little bit about this idea of SRE. We talked a little about these ideas, talked a little bit, how to organize things. But again, it all comes back to the people, right? An SRE team is great. You could put it down on paper and say, oh, we're going to build out the most magnificent SRE team ever built. It's going to be comprised of the industry tastemakers and all the greatest influencers on earth. That's great. But like, those are humans, right? And you have to be able to find those humans. And where do you find them? Who are these people that are going to help you develop your program, that are going to help you on this journey that you're now so interested and invigorated and want to be a part of? And so that's going to bring us sort of to our next section, which quite appropriately, right, are our tips on finding and growing SRE talent, right? Brass tacks, hiring is hard, right? Hiring is hard everywhere, always. So there's nothing that we're going to say here that is necessarily going to make hiring easier, but it should at least help you to understand the role a little better and to help you focus your hiring efforts and to give you an idea of who you should be looking for, where you should be looking for these people. And does that mean internally, externally? We'll get into that. So again, SRE is people, right? So SREs have personalities, sometimes big personalities. And speaking of big personalities, Waldo, what would you say are some common personalities and traits that we find in a lot of people who have accepted the SRE as their discipline?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Daniel. So some of the common skills that and traits, they tend to be expert code reviewers. They're very good at looking, like really grokking in full what is actually happening, and if or how it differs from what the intent was from said engineer. Of course, engineers are by nature problem solvers, but these people are generally on a slightly higher level. They look at everything as kind of an interesting challenge. They tend to be autodidacts and have multiple languages and paradigms under their belt just out of interest. They tend to pick things up and don't get terribly intimidated when they don't know something. That's just start opening browser tabs and diving in. They're often going to have a wide, these are often very broadly skilled people, and they'll have a couple areas of deep expertise. And the great thing about that is, come to it later in this list, is that you don't need to have a team that looks the same skill-wise. In fact, it's better that you don't. But I'll come back to that in a moment. An excellent SRE is going to be great at communicating in different ways. And I know every job description, like basically the boilerplate requires, must have excellent communication skills, but these people really need it. They need to communicate across broad swaths of skill set, personality types, learning types, and organizational levels. You're gonna speak differently to a director than you are to a junior software engineer. These people are inherently, like, they may be set up to as a consultant internally, depending on how you end up using them, but when they consider themselves a part of all the teams that they work with. It's very much a we language. And with that said, there's a lot of trust that they expect and that they give by default. They're not there to make anybody look bad, or they want things to be better for all of us. They're also not, maybe not naturally, but they want everybody to get better. So there's a lot of mentoring and teaching that they do just as in the daily course of their activities. Now, you'll notice that none of these skills or traits are technical. These are all meta human characteristics, and they're related, but they're pretty wide ranging. Now, the bad news is you're very rarely going to find somebody with all these skills. Like they're the people who have all of these skills are very rare. The good news is you don't need to waste time trying to find a unicorn. If you go into it looking to build a team that that supplements each other and overlaps, you're going to be much happier and much more successful in your hiring practices. So, yeah, Leo, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, not really. I think you covered it pretty well. But maybe there's a couple of concepts that I think, at least personally, when we set up our recruiting pipelines, are very important. I think, as you said, diversity is something that I always have in mind when I'm staffing a team, because it really what brings the balance in these teams, like having people from different backgrounds. Like sometimes it could mean someone coming from the systems world versus like the software world, or someone that has expertise on that part of the stack versus that other part. It can mean many things, but really having a diverse team is really how I've seen like the best team perform in my experience. And maybe another thing that I think is super important is what you meant with code reviews and people's ability to get to unknowns. And in my experience, also, it's something that we always talk about writing code, but there's even more to that writing code. When you're an SRE, you're often reading a lot of code, and it seems easy, but the problem with reading code is sometimes you're not reading your code or even your team's code. So you're reading something completely different. Sometimes it's third-party code. And that takes a lot of experience and a lot of like a different approach than just relying on kind of like knowing your environment and your code base and your tools. Sometimes you have to deal with something completely different that you've never seen before. And so in that personality that usually SRE have, they like this, approaching unknowns and not being scared of them, but actually digging through them.
Yeah, that's super clutch. Yeah, to take an example, here at Datadog, we use Kubernetes fairly heavily, and have a lot of commits on various Kubernetes projects, either core or in the ecosystem. And the SRE team has been a really big part of that. And people who are involved in that have to not only have a really solid understanding of our products, of our business, of our organization, how we do things, but also have to be able to hold all of those things from a completely separate party, in this case, the whole Kubernetes ecosystem and how they do things and whatnot, and manage to somehow overlap these two things in their heads, right? That's the sort of personality that's going to do well in this role. And those people could come kind of from anywhere, right? In fact, that really brings to the next slide, which is that, I can't seem to switch slides. There we go. That SREs come from a lot of different types of backgrounds, right? It's easy to look at people coming from traditional ops backgrounds, network engineering backgrounds, system administrators, sysops used to be called back in the 80s, or traditional developer profiles and go, oh, that's who we should be looking at. Those are the people who are going to be building out our SRE program. And you know what? You're not wrong, right? People coming from traditional ops and dev profiles often have the right capacities and the right personality traits and just frankly the interest to do it. But that's not the only place, right? It's also important to look elsewhere, because as Leo mentioned, diversity is a big part of what makes a successful SRE team. A diversity of backgrounds, of ways of looking at things, of life experience, of tech experience, so on and so forth, just bringing a lot of different things to the table. For instance, at Datadog, we've had people come from other areas of the organization. We've a person with a PhD, someone who's dropped out of high school, right? Don't get too bogged down with the resume, right? Don't get too bogged down with, oh, this person did that, this person does that, they'll immediately be a good SRE. Really focus on those personality traits, and that's going to be sort of the North Star when you're looking for how do we build out our SRE team. And that's going to hold true for hiring, recruiting from the outside, as well as, and I think this is super important, nurturing from the inside, right? Leo, can you give us any examples of nurturing from the inside that have worked well at Datadog?
Yeah, sure. I think, in general, some people have a hard time defining themselves as SREs, and it takes, really concrete examples for people to realize what SRE is about. I think in the slide earlier, we had a few examples of what that could be. For instance, participating in incidents, participating in, debugging a bug that's complex across multiple systems, things like that. And I found that a very good way usually to get on board with SRE is we have a mentorship program at Datadog. And so we have established a list of mentors that really want to help people, like get new skills. And I found that personally, when I have mentored some people and, worked through them, some very specific problems on production, for instance, they actually understood and were way more interested in SRE and realized that's the thing that they actually like in their job, and not, writing code, but actually going through those problems. So I think it's one of the area where doing it for real, really makes a big difference in understanding what it is. So I would suggest that for anyone that wants to get into SRE.
Yeah, I mean, just, dive right in, give it a go. And you mentioned, mentoring, right? And that's something that Waldo touched on earlier, is that one of the traits of a good SRE program is that it has the capacity to mentor, it has the capacity to teach. And that's actually super important. So speaking of more concrete stuff, let's actually just drive right ahead now and talk about some practical suggestions for doing the SRE. Right? We've already touched on a few already. So why don't we go through just, a few more basically, right? So when we talk about SRE, what does that mean? Is it a team? Is it an embedded resource? Right? How are you actually going to do the SRE? How are you going to fire that program up? Waldo, hints and tips.
Well, I hate to give an it depends, but it depends. And the things that are going to impact this, like your capacity and how to effectively do this, it's going the main factor is going to be on the talent and the personalities that you have access to, and no two programs are going to look exactly the same, because you just have a different ecosystem to work with. So let's assume that you're willing to try different modes, and you're willing to attempt multiple experiments, despite both the successes and failures that you encounter. Having one success does not mean this will always work. So treat each case as its own thing. You can rotate around and try different things, and what works now might not work in 6 months. Just be willing to pivot, be willing to change, and constantly reevaluate how things are working. Now, as much as I'd love to give you a definitive right way, it really just doesn't exist. However, the great news is that these experiences that you have, these experiments that you run, and being self-aware of how things are going, it leads to plenty of opportunities for you to write papers and blog posts and submit to conferences. Not to be entirely self-serving, but it is good for you. People love hearing case studies. They love a war story. Look at it that way.
And that's fair. So at Datadog, and I'm sure as Leo, you'll be able to attest to, it's not as if we woke up one morning and said, okay, we have an SRE program now and it's amazing, right? It takes time to grow, and you have to be willing to make mistakes, and you have to be willing to be critical about that. And I don't mean mean. I mean looking at things with a critical eye and going, this worked, this didn't. Why did this work? Why didn't this work? How can we improve sort of going forward? And it's definitely good to learn from your successes, but really where you truly grow and evolve, right, is learning from your failures. And with that in mind, let's talk about some pitfalls, right? Leo, without going into too many sordid details, can you give us sort of an idea of a little bit about how we got to where we are now? Did we make any sort of mistakes? And what did we learn from that? And how did we grow?
Sure. So one key thing about what you just said is, be willing to get it wrong potentially. And another way to describe it, I think, is, use the same terminology that we're using for software now we've been using for years. Saying that we need to do small iterations. We need to understand, once we finished an iteration, what went right, but also what went wrong. And so why would we do the same for, putting together an organization? I think it's really key because, if you take a look at the SRE book, it has maybe 25 chapters. It's not about using all these 25 chapters and crossing, a very long list of things. But my recommended approach, and maybe one of the pitfalls that I see and that we might have, went to when we created the first SRE group at Datadog, is trying too many things at once. And so another key when doing iteration is to keep these iterations small enough so that you can actually understand if your impact comes from that iteration or if it's just completely random. If you have too many variables, then you don't really understand what your impact is. And so one of the pitfalls and an advice from that would be, try one concept at a time and implement it, and then rinse and repeat. Like if it works, then let's keep it. If it doesn't work, let's change it. One of the usual way to start an SRE group is, think about production excellence. And that's actually how we started the SRE group at Datadog. So once you get to production, there's a certain standard that you potentially want to achieve for services. And that can mean sometimes automation, handling some types of failures that are common in your infrastructure. But that was one of the ways we approached the SRE concepts, by having a team that would partner with other product teams to help them kind of improve their services before they would land to production. And that was one way to see it, but then we eventually realized that sometimes, it's too late. When you're thinking about putting a service in production, some of the mistakes in design or like some architecture problems are already there, ready to ship to production. So that's when we realized that actually, it's not only about reviewing things when they're ready, but it's also much more, being influential when you design things. And so that's when we started sending SREs rather than like having them into a single team to embed with other product teams. And that's something that worked well for us, but I'm not saying that it would work perfectly for you, depending on, again, your type of organization and your problem. That might be different, but I'm just, sharing a little bit of feedback there.
For sure, and that's good feedback. And I have some questions around that, which we'll get into in a moment when we get into the Q&A, which is coming right up. So just to wrap up what we forgot for the slides, before we get into the Q&A, to go over very briefly what it is we were talking about, right? We established some common terminology. We said, okay, what are we talking about when we use these words? And that was not only for the benefit of this presentation, but also for you, the audience. If you want to be able to go out and have these conversations, talk about these things in your organization, you need to be able to have that common language and that common framework to be working from. And we talked about team and organizational structure, squads, guilds. These are actionable things you can do within your organization. Where do you find SREs? Who are they? What are they like? Super important. And then, of course, a little bit about some of the pitfalls and whatnot. from Ken. So we could have a test automation guild and a squad to say implement consumer-driven contracts as an example. Leo, would those be reasonable guilds?
For the example of the guild, that seems like, very, very in line with the definition of the guild we gave. And, we're not like saying that's the ultimate definition of a guild. That's, one way to approach them again. And I think test automation, or like testing in general, could be, a community of engineers that are focused on all these testing mechanisms. So that definitely makes sense. For implement consumer-driven contracts as a squad, I think it's, again, like I think you have something very specific in mind when you think about that. And the one caveat I could see there is you would have to pay a lot of attention when you define the objectives of such a squad if you want it short-lived, because implementing consumer-driven contract could be something that sounds recurring. You could have more contracts in the future, and so that squad would never really finish. So in that case, maybe you want to think about a different organization and find owners for that in the longer term.
Yeah, that almost sounds like a product team to me. Like there's a business problem that needs to be solved, and so you want to stand up a team to solve it and ideally operate that solution. Whether and when I mention that, it doesn't necessarily when bringing a solution to bear doesn't necessarily mean that you have to build it from scratch. You could, if there's a SaaS that or some off-the-shelf software that solves your problem for you, that team then manages that relationship. They they become the subject matter experts, and maybe that's not enough. That doesn't fully occupy that team's capabilities. So maybe you give them additional problems to solve. So there are a lot of ways to slice it. And it depends.
That actually brings up an interesting question. We're talking about how to organize, and we talk about guilds, we talk about squads. Is it possible? Is it advisable to have a single human that's actually part of multiple guilds, that's part of multiple squads? Is that something that could work, Leo?
Well, it depends how many hours you have in the day, obviously, and that can depend for everyone, but it is definitely possible. Obviously, if you think about someone that is, for instance, working in a product team and is also like, taking responsibility in a guild or a squad, you have to clarify, with that person what percentage of time is spent in that squad or guild, and what percentage of time is spent in that, in their regular team. If that's clear enough, and you're not expecting too much from someone and not 200% of that person's time, that's fine. But obviously, if you tell me 12 guilds and 2 squads, I'm going to be very, very curious about how you make that work.
That's fair. And you talked a little bit there about leadership, right? Like how are we going to actually figure out who's doing what and how much? And that actually leads into one of the other questions that got asked. So we'll do it right now from anonymous attendee. Thank you. How many people are too many in a guild? Do you have any formal leaders in these cross-team guilds? Do you rely on self-organization? What do you think, Leo?
So the first question is the size. I don't know if anyone knows the pizza team analogy, but I'll still use it, which is basically, what's the right amount of people to share a pizza. I'll leave you to that. But for a squad, I think a good role is basically a pizza team. So maybe 2 to 5 people is usually a good, focused, nimble squad. For a guild, it's a larger group, as you said earlier, Dan. So maybe it's a 2 pizza team. I think that's a good description. For the leadership, it's a little bit, again, of a it depends question. I think for a squad, it definitely needs a leader. So usually, because someone gets to organize like sprints in that squad. And so it's just about, managing, doing the more project management stuff and making sure we are making progress on the objectives. For a guild, as we said, it's a little bit more of a community feeling. So sometimes it doesn't require as much as a strong leader for a guild to succeed, and can be kind of like self-organized. But what I've found in the past is if there is no, at least not a group of people that's clearly identified as leaders, like usually the guild don't persist that much, because they'll eventually die and people will not be so motivated to contribute to the guild anymore. And so it still requires a fair amount of leadership, I think, to succeed.
And that, that speaks to, we were talking about having that buy-in as well, right? One can self-organize and elect a leader internally, but you have to have that up and down the chain support, right? And that's super critical for, that cross-team capacity, for being able to make decisions that affect other business units. You need to have that buy-in, and that comes ultimately from an exec or someone higher up in the organization that can then come down and get to the boots on the ground. A deep and complex subject that requires a deep and complex answer, and we've only got like 60 seconds, so we'll move on to the next question. Once again, when you talked about sending an SRE engineer to the product team to collaborate in the design phase itself, what guidelines or high-level direction would the SRE give to the product team here? Looking for some concrete examples if possible. Leo, what do you got for us?
Something that's I think key in those early stages, design decisions, is understanding the customer facing features that you want to provide. And there, we didn't talk a lot about SLOs, which are service level objectives, but basically what that means is up to what point you want to be either available, or you want your latency to match a certain target. And sometimes not having SREs in these early stages might lead to overshooting in terms of the reliability target that we expect. So if you overshooting too high, usually that means that your development is going to be very slow for not a lot of added value. And you might over-engineer things, or increase the cost of such a system just because you're trying to make it too reliable, or you're trying to get your latency too low, where it doesn't really matter to the customer in the end. And if you're like shooting too low, then you're going to have problems again, because obviously your customers are going to be unhappy. So really, like the good example I can give is SREs being there at the beginning and asking those kind of questions will lead to like making the right trade-offs in general. It's not going to be perfect, of course. Don't expect perfection, but it might improve that.
Another good example there would be coming sort of from the serverless space, right? So in the world of serverless, you're paying for resources per function, right? And from a product perspective, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but many times from the product perspective, you want to go straight at the best possible user experience. And the best possible user experience might necessitate a large amount of resources being dedicated to that, to a given function. And that's going to end up, costing a lot of money, right? If you could bring someone in at a fairly early stage that is familiar with the technology, is familiar with the paradigm, right? And go, hey, this is great, but here's what it's going to cost, right? Sometimes that changes the discussion, hopefully in positive directions. Waldo,
Leo, would you say that in terms of resiliency, and would you suggest having discussions about core versus nice to have features in terms of graceful degradation? And likewise, what are some thoughts on monitoring your identifying and being aware of your dependencies? For instance, like a message queue or a database where it's got almost no latency and it's always available on your laptop, but the real world doesn't always work like that. So being aware of your dependencies and mitigating somebody else's failures and fluctuations. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's bringing, early in the discussion, those failure modes, basically, thinking about all the ways of a system where they could potentially fail and how. And I would add to that I think software engineers usually do that by themselves, but what the experience of an SRE really brings to that conversation is being more pragmatic, usually about thinking about this resilience. A quick example for that is that software engineers will usually prioritize some more complex failure scenarios, in my experience, like a brain split in your database, or some packet loss on a link in your data center, or things like that. Whereas some more frequent failures, like a machine just dies and you have to replace it, is something that, for instance, an SRE will know that happens twice a day, for instance. And once he brings that to the conversation and saying, but what happens when that machine reboots twice a day and it changes the whole architecture of the system, it does improve a lot, from the start, the resilience of such a system. So it's not only about thinking about it, because I think you can spend the next 12 months making your system more resilient, but it's also like making like the pragmatic prioritization between the different failure modes that you want to be actually resilient for.
That's an excellent observation. We have not only bumped up on time, but walked right across it. But I do want to address one last question. We'll call it the lightning round. From anonymous attendee, what skills do you want your SREs to know or to learn for the present day and for the future? 60 seconds. Waldo, you first.
Semper Gumby, being flexible. Every day is a new challenge often. And how you plan to start your day may not be how it actually goes. So being able to roll with things is, I think, super valuable in maintaining a good working relationship and your mental health.
Nice, nice. Leo?
I think we just talked about resilience, and I definitely think that SREs should be more focused on resilience and understanding what that means. I'm not going to make a 2 hours discussion on resilience versus reliability, but I think resilience is something that's existed for a while now in different industries. We send some rockets to the moon, so it's got to be pretty resilient. But really, I think it's kind of a new concept in our industry, and there's a lot of interesting conversations happening about it. And just being resilient is, I think, a key to a successful SRE. So I would definitely encourage SREs to look into that.
What do you think,
Absolutely.
Daniel?
What do I think? I would, we talk about, the qualities and things we can learn. Some of these things can be taught, and some of these things are personality traits. And, I would say, honestly, just patience, just learning to wait, right? Because sometimes that is the hardest thing.
Right. And this is actually where I'd like to address that question that came up a little bit earlier, which was that people have this notion that automation would make their job redundant. How do you get over this and make your team understand that automation is key? This is a pitfall, right? This is an idea that people have, that they're scared that automation is going to run them out of a job. And this is a hole organizations can fall into that's going to prevent them from succeeding with their DevOps journey, from succeeding with their implementation of SRE. And to that, it's a huge, huge area, right? But for that, I really want to take you back to this idea of toil, and this idea of the computer should do what the computer does best. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the computer is probably more reliable, right? Probably. Okay. The computer could probably do it faster. The computer can do it outside of normal business hours, et cetera, right? So this is all well and true and good. And that sounds obvious, but really the key thing here is that you want to unlock that human potential, right? We're not depriving people of jobs. That's That's not the way to frame it. The way to frame it is that we're unlocking those people to do better and more interesting things. We're unlocking that potential to actually move the business forward. We're unlocking that potential to actually improve things because now we have the time and the energy to dedicate to those things that was just previously being expended on logging into 19 machines one after another and running a script.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. The I've in my nearly 20-year career in tech, I have automated myself, improved the situation such that I was no longer needed. Exactly once. It's not that it doesn't happen. The vast majority of the time, though, automating things and removing toil has led to a noted improvement in my quality of life. Not only because I was doing less toil, less uninteresting work, but the opposite. I got to do more interesting work. I got to solve better problems. And that I think is key. It's not like it's not that Daniel hit it exactly right. We get to actually actively improve things. Yeah.
So to just wrap up that idea, again, the idea is not to deprive people of jobs. The idea is actually to make people's jobs better and more interesting and more vital, and to turn what might have been a cost center into a value generator.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
And that's, if we want to frame it in a business capacity as opposed to a technological capacity, that's certainly a way to do it. And it's a reasonably healthy way to look at that. And it's how we look at it, right, at Datadog. Speaking of how we do things at Datadog, second great question. So thank you, Michael, for this. Which SRE organization works better for Datadog, standalone or embedded? And of course, why? And here's the best part about answering this question. It's both.
Yep.
We do have an actual SRE team. Right, so a cohort of individuals that are referred to as site reliability engineers of various levels, junior, senior, staff, so on and so forth. So they're grouped together. That team is responsible for staggeringly wide variety of things within the organization, technologically speaking, and then it's broken out into a number of sections internally as well. So is there an SRE team composed of SREs? Yes, and they're responsible for things. We'll get into those things in a moment. Do we also do embedded? Yes, right? So from that cohort of experienced, competent individuals, product teams or squads or guilds or whatever, right, can actually have someone from that team come and embed with them. Right? So that can take a couple of different forms. It's not a one size fits all. The idea is that talent can come in and try to solve specific problems or try to improve specific situations, either on a limited engagement or a long-term engagement, right? It's sort of a Swiss Army knife type scenario, if you will, right? It's conceivable. Well, I don't know. I don't want to hog the mic here. Waldo, would you like to jump in?
Yeah. So I think it would be fair to say that our SRE skill works both as a product team responsible for discrete things, but it's also in some ways, there are also SREs on individual product teams. And that's kind of where the guild idea comes into play, is that sharing of knowledge, that recommending practices, just interactions on a skill oriented level, that comes in very valuable to us.
Absolutely. So again, which works better for Datadog? The answer ultimately is both. And you'll see this at other organizations as well, but there again, it's not necessarily one size fits all sort of a thing. Another question here. So thank you for this. Sandeep, thank you for the nice talk. You're welcome. Thank you. What are the must-have skills for an individual SRE? You mentioned personalities for a team. We were mentioning personalities for individuals as well as for teams. Those things we were talking about in terms of being willing to stare at code, having good communication capacity and whatnot, that's certainly true of the team, of the cohort when viewed as an organism, but that also drills down into the individual, right? A successful site reliability engineer, either embedded on a team or as part of a cohort, right, is going to have a mix and match of those capacities, of those personality traits. When you talk about must-have skills, certainly it's those things, but I suspect you're also maybe asking a little bit about, you know, technology. What are some things we'll commonly see, for example, on a resume or on a CV for people who are performant in the SRE area? And the answer there, as Waldo would say, is it depends. Right? It depends on your all of them. It depends on your organization, right? Now, for us, many of the people on our SRE, performing the function of SRE, have a fairly deep and critical understanding of Kubernetes, because we run everything on Kubernetes. So that makes sense. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all SREs have to know Kubernetes. If your organization doesn't use it, not everybody needs to know it, right? I hope that answered your question.
Actually, ties into the Q&A question that came up from anonymous attendee. That's a fantastic name. It provided a lot of our questions today. What programming or scripting languages have you found to be most effective for the role? Which ones do you use predominantly at Datadog? All of them. So yeah, again, it depends. Datadog historically had been Python, like for a while it was solely a Python company. We've invested a lot in Golang for a number of reasons that we don't really need to get into. So we do have both of those. As Daniel said, we have a lot of Kubernetes, so we are of course YAML engineers as well. And but we do have a sprinkling of other languages as well. I'm pretty sure there's some Scala. There's just all kinds of stuff. And it's really just being pragmatic about the skills and languages and techniques that you need to solve the problem.
This actually touches on one of the pitfalls,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Tyranny of choice.
Yes.
And this is going to be true of 3 people working in somebody's living room doing a startup to 300,000 people in some sort of massive organization. Is the tyranny of choice is real. What do I mean by that? It means if you don't have those guardrails, if you don't have those, you know, here is what we do because this is what makes sense and is sane for us. If those basic elements aren't in place, things go off the rails really quickly, and you get into a situation where you do have a zillion programming languages and a zillion frameworks and a zillion ways of doing things. And okay, maybe that is good and true for your organization. I'm not here to judge, but it is also conceivable that may be slowing you down, that may be making it harder for you to be on the same page with your product teams, between organizations. I'm not saying it is the case, I'm saying it might be the case, right? So we talk about what have we found to be effective for the role, and what have we found to be effective at Datadog? Those are 2 different things, right? Waldo touched on what's effective.
Personal things.
They're very personal, exactly. So what's for the role? Waldo's exactly correct. The role is whatever need the organization needs, right? What do we use at Datadog? A lot of Python, a lot of Go, a little bit of Rust, a fair amount of JavaScript, some C. Probably more C than we'll admit to, frankly. And you'll see things, a smattering of things here and there, right? But yeah, a lot of Python, a lot of Go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But another pitfall that I really want to stress is that, you know, the SRE book is great, and it has a lot of information. It provides a fresh perspective that, unless you worked at Google, you probably don't have. But it's important to remember that Google's problems probably aren't your problems. They wrote the book for themselves, and what's more, even internally, at Google, the SRE book isn't universal. It's a great, I mean, Google is a huge company with a lot of products, with lots of different lots of different problems that need different solutions. So in other words, this is a great place to start, but you need to do your own research and run your own experiments.
So we're bumping up on time, and there was a great question here from Rahul, which I think is going to really bookend this nicely. I am an engineering manager for a product team. Our SRE culture is that the product team is on the hook for keeping our services up. Bold. No separate SRE team. We use Datadog. What are good resources to level up product engineers to understand ins and outs of service uptime? That's a great question. We're talking about service uptime. We're actually touching on a couple of beautiful acronyms that you may have encountered, SLI, SLO, and SLA. So service level indicators, service level objectives, and service level agreements. So very, very quickly, what's a great resource? First up, Wikipedia. Second stop, actually, is that we supply, and we have some workshops and some great blog posts on these acronyms. What does reliability look like? How do you measure it? How do you choose good targets? Who should be responsible for those targets? How do you measure those things correctly and efficiently, right? So the Datadog blog is a good place to look. learn.datadoghq.com is a good place to look. Our YouTube channel, right, where we've got talks from our engineers, from our product people surrounding uptime and these ideas of SLOs and SLAs and SLIs. Those are some great resources. That's honestly, that's where I'd look. And not only because I happen to work for Datadog, but this is our jam. This is literally what we do. So our material here is pretty solid. That's it. We're at time. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming through. Seriously. And thank you, everybody, for the great questions. Really, this is what's the fulfilling part about all this.